And so just to let you know that we are carrying on with our series, which is the Power of Three, which is the series we've been following throughout Easter. And the thought behind that is what the power three actually means. I mean, what the number three actually means in Jewish literature. And so we focused on instances where this has been this has been highlighted by the authors of the Bible because they knew what this would have meant to those who would have read these particular passages. And so just to also play around with it even more today, we thought we could focus on three friends who were really close to Jesus. They were siblings, but we're going to focus on their role as friends, and that is Lazarus, Martha, and Mary, Christ's three friends. And so it reads as follows. Now, a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and Martha and his sister. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sister sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is sick." When he heard this, Jesus said, "The sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. And then he said to his disciples, "Let us go back to Judea." "But Rabbi," they said, "a short while ago the Jews there tried to stone us, and yet you are going back?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they see by this world light. It is when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light." After he said this, he went on to tell them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up." His disciples replied, "Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better." Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So then he told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. And for your sake, I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go." Then Thomas, also known as Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." And so from here, we're going to move on, and we're going to go to John chapter 12. That is the next chapter. But just to give you guys some info, what happens in between the two scriptures is that Jesus surely gets to where Lazarus had been buried. It was the 4th day since he'd been buried. And when Jesus arrives at that particular place, he says, "Lazarus, wake up." And miraculously, Lazarus was actually resurrected from dead, something that had never been seen before, more especially because it was the 4th day. But I'll explain more about that later. And so we carry on from John chapter 12, which reads as follows. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. Martha served, while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. Then Mary took about a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But one of the disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. "Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wage." He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief, a keeper of the money bag. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. "Leave her alone," Jesus replied. "It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial." And so this is the word of the Lord, and thanks be to God. And so I'm going to ask that you journey with me as we consider all of the characters that are mentioned in the Bible scripture that we have just read. And so the first is obviously the one person who this story is centered around, and that is Jesus. Now, Jesus had been doing a whole lot of things. This is heading towards the end of his ministry here on earth. It is the third year of his ministry. Jesus has been seen healing the blind. He's been seen healing those who are paralyzed. He's been seen doing radical stuff and even at times making very radical statements. Jesus was loved by some at this moment, but there were those who were not happy with some of the things that Jesus was doing and some of the statements he was making. He's known as a teacher. He's known as a prophet. He's known as a miracle performer. He's known as all of that. And at the same time, there are just those who are not happy with Jesus, more especially because time and again, he would refer to himself as the Messiah. He would refer to himself as the one who'd been sent by God. And for some people, this was almost blasphemous. In actual fact, just before this particular scripture, when you read in John 10, we read about how they wanted to kill Jesus, how some of the Jews in Jerusalem wanted to stone Jesus. And it is at that point that Jesus then retreated to a place that is not really mentioned. And having retreated there, some people who came from Mary and Martha came to Jesus and told him that Lazarus was sick. And that is because they knew that, okay, number one, this guy's been healing people. This guy's been performing miracles. This guy spent most of his time doing great stuff, helping those who were paralyzed, helping those who couldn't see. And so surely, if his dear friend is sick, he will do something about it. This is more like you and I. I always chat to my friends who are doctors, and they always say that there's nothing as awkward as getting to a braai and telling people that you're a doctor, because the conversation changes, and suddenly everyone's asking you about their eye, about their sore knee. It's like getting to a braai and you tell them that you're a pastor. Suddenly everything changes. People start justifying why they haven't been going to church, and they start telling you stuff like, no man, I drink, but it's really occasionally. You know, it is the most awkward thing. And so, as it always happens, these guys who were sent by Mary and Martha, they knew that Jesus could perform miracles. They knew that Jesus had healed the blind. They knew that Jesus had healed the sick. They knew that Jesus had helped people who were paralyzed for years. So clearly he'd be able to do this for Lazarus. And so they come to Jesus. They find him from the place at which he had retreated to after the Jews tried to stone him. And they tell him about his friend. Your friend Lazarus is sick. Now, Jesus does not reply as a friend who is dearly, dearly passionate about their friend's life. But instead of going with these friends, because this was clearly an emergency, Jesus decides to stay 2 more days when his dear friend is dying, and dying probably towards death. And that's the decision that Jesus takes. This is more like going into an emergency unit in a hospital, and you get there and you report this patient that is about to die, and this nurse replies and says, just wait a second, I've got something else to do. Surely, these 2 guys must have been disappointed. Surely his disciples must have been asking questions. He then goes to his disciples and he says to them, look guys, we have to go back to Judea because Lazarus, our friend, has fallen asleep. And they're thinking, dude, if he's asleep, surely he will wake up. Or maybe they must have thought he's just in a coma and he will wake up at some point. They did not see how this was a big deal. Remember, these guys were nearly stoned in Judea. And now Jesus is asking them to go back to the same place. And so they were not buying it. This just did not make sense. And Jesus eventually tells them, he is actually dead. We have to go back. Even that did not convince them. As a matter of fact, when Thomas, who always believes by seeing, replies, he says, look, guys, let's go back with Jesus so that we too can die with him. And so these guys go back to Judea where Lazarus was sick. And so on their way there, a couple of miles before they get to Bethany, where Lazarus was, Martha actually comes to Jesus and she says to him, had you been around, Lazarus would not have died. You know, I want you to understand the position of Martha. It is like knowing about someone, knowing of someone who can cure a disease that you have, knowing of someone who can help you at a particular time of need. But they just did not come on time. And so Martha was deeply disappointed. Martha was with Jesus. She saw Jesus heal people. She saw Jesus bring back people, heal people who were paralyzed, who'd been paralyzed for years. She heard of how Jesus had healed a man who'd been paralyzed for 38 years. And she says to him, had you been there, surely Lazarus would not have died. This deeply relates with what you and I often go through. There are times when we go through tragedies and we almost want to say, God, had you acted at that particular moment, I know that this tragedy would not have happened. Lord, had you acted at that particular moment when a loved one was sick to the point of death, this would have not happened. I have read in the Bible about the great miracles that you've performed. I know that you are the same God who at some point when the Israelites were being chased by the Egyptians, you separated the water so that they could go through. I know that you are the same God who brought Jesus back to life. And so often our frustration with God, with reconciling God, and difficult moments that we go through is not us questioning God's ability to help, but is us saying, God, we know that you could have done something. Why didn't you do something? Why did you not act at that particular moment? When my parents were going through a difficult time, why did you not act at that particular moment? When loved ones were going through difficult financial times, so much so that it even threatened their marriage and their family, why didn't you do something at that particular moment? You see, it is not God's strength that we often doubt, but what we often doubt is why God did not act at that particular time of need. And so Martha asked Jesus, Lord, had you been here, I know that Lazarus would not have died. I know that Lazarus would be still alive. Now, I just want to introduce you to Mary. Now, Mary is a completely different character. You know, often when we read through the Bible, we find that Mary is this organized lady. She's always there. She's the host. She's always there making sure that things are in order. In Luke, when we read about how Jesus is sitting with Martha, not Mary, how Jesus is sitting with Martha and Mary when he visits their household, at some point Martha turns around because Mary was just sitting at the feet of Jesus, and Martha turns around while she is busy making sure that Jesus is perfectly hosted. She says, God, don't you care that I am busy working and my sister's just sitting at your feet? That was her personality. Even later on, which we'll speak about, you find that when Lazarus is hosting Jesus for a meal, and Mary goes on and breaks the alabaster jar, Martha was out there working. She was serving. She wanted to make sure that everything was in place. And you can even see that attitude when she comes to Jesus. And Jesus says to her, Martha, do not worry. Lazarus will be resurrected. The first thing she says is, I know that he will be resurrected on the last day. You see, in her thinking, things work systematically. You are born, you die, and the only time resurrection can happen is on the last day. She's this person that stacks things in order. In actual fact, chatting to a friend about today's sermon, I said, if Martha was part of our office, she would be that one person who would get all the administrative responsibility correct. She would do things well at all times. And that is her personality. That is who she is. We can't change that about Martha. In actual fact, some speculation, some biblical scholars speculate that Martha would have most likely been a firstborn. And as a first girl, she would have been taught how to host households. And so she was socialized like this. You must remember that in those days, women didn't go to school. They didn't get any form of religious education. The only thing they waited for was that one day they'd be married and they would have children, and that would be the highlight of their stay on earth, having a baby boy who would continue the family legacy. And so, as a firstborn girl, in addition to that, you would be taught how to look after guests. You'd be taught how to look after people. You'd be taught how to be the head hostess. And so, this is something Martha had in her. She was socialized to be this kind of person. And I know that amongst us here, there are people who are like that. I got a colleague. I don't know where Elsa is. All of us in the office, we've got this thing that we sign, a register. Do you know when my register gets signed? I hope Fiona's not watching this. My register gets signed at the end of every month. Check in, check in, check in, check in, check in. Elsa, I promise you, first thing she does when she gets to the office, she signs her register. And that's who she is. That's her upbringing. That's the kind of person she is. And that is the kind of person Martha was. Everything had to be in order. Even when Jesus says Lazarus will be resurrected, it doesn't make sense for her because remember, it is birth, it's death, and then on the last day, it's resurrection. And so she replies to Jesus, I know, Lord, that he'll be resurrected on the last day. Anyways, she then runs to Mary, and she tells her that the Lord is here. Mary then runs off with Martha. Now, you must remember that in those days, after someone had passed on, they would bury them on the first day. So, since Lazarus had already died, he would have already been buried. And in him being buried, he would have been wrapped around, he would have been, there's something that looked like a napkin, that looked like a diaper, that they would have put on his face to cover his face, and then a stone would have been rolled over his grave, and so people would then start mourning. So it's not like us, we mourn and then we go bury people. They would bury people and then they would go through the bereavement process. And so they would do that, but then they would also go mourn at the particular grave site where the person had been buried. And so Mary is sitting there at that particular moment, and while Mary is actually sitting there, Martha comes through and tells her, Mary, Jesus is here. Mary gets up from that position. Look at this. It's like she moves from one mood to another. She moves from this place of mourning to run to the Master to utter the same words. And all of these people who were weeping with her, who were mourning with her, followed her, thinking that she would now go mourn at the gravesite, in keeping with their tradition. But when they saw where she went, they actually realized she was going to Jesus. And some of them start skinnering, start asking questions. Isn't that Jesus? Weren't they best friends? Isn't this the person who really loved them? They start asking questions. And some start saying, if he loved him, why did he not stop him from dying? Surely he could open up the eyes of the blind. Surely he healed those who were paralyzed. Why could he not stop his own friend from dying? There are times when you and I as Christians are even afraid to speak about our troubles, our challenges, our problems, and our temptations, because the first thing people want to say is, aren't you a Christian? Surely if you're a Christian, you can make it out of this. Surely if you're a Christian, you shouldn't be faced with such temptations. Surely if you're a Christian, you shouldn't be going through difficult times. And that's what they said. They said, if this guy was Lazarus' best friend, how did he allow for this to happen? And so Mary goes to the Master. And at that moment, Jesus says to Mary, where is he buried? They ran to the graveside where Lazarus was buried. And when they got there, Jesus calls out Lazarus. But before we even focus or even unpack the resurrection of Lazarus, I also want to introduce you to Mary. So, Mary is one of the most interesting characters. Firstly, both Mary and Martha are females, and they're following a rabbi around. This is a very patriarchal society where women would have not been allowed to be involved in theological conversations. Women weren't allowed to be following rabbis around. Women weren't allowed to dare attempt to become something. But Jesus disrupts that. He shakes that to the point that when we read later on in John, these women are the first to announce the good news. Now, we are not sure how Mary actually encounters Jesus. Most of the stuff that we usually suggest is speculative. We try to put pieces and parts of the Bible together to say, perhaps this is what happened. But if there's one thing that we can pick up from Mary's personality, is that she was one of those people all or nothing. She was not about to hold back. If I'm going to love you, I'm going to love you. If I'm going to spend time with you, I'm going to spend time with you. She was not one of those people, I'm going to come to church on a Sunday once a month, and then I'm not going to come next week. Remember the passage where her sister Martha complains and says, Lord, aren't you worried? Does it not bother you that Martha is just sitting at your feet and I'm here doing everything? You see, that was Martha's personality. She was going to go all out. She sits at Jesus' feet. And that is part of the reason we sometimes even speculate that Martha's maybe the woman who had 7 demons that encountered Jesus. Because one thing we can pick up from Martha is that she's this person that gave it all, that gave away everything so that she could have everything in Jesus. That's one thing we pick up. And I don't know about you, even when you look at tradition and when you look at everyday life, we realize that often those people who used to live a life of great sin, who used to live a life that was very sinful, when they come across Jesus, they give it all. They give it all. They got nothing to hold back. It does not make them any better than the Marthas, but it's just their personality. When they found themselves tempted to go into sin, this sin might have been drugs, whatever it might have been, they went all in. They didn't hold back. And in the same light, when Jesus saves them, when they decide to let go of drugs, when they decide to let go of whatever sin that they were suffering with, they go all in. And that is their personality. And those are the people, I don't know about you, have you ever been at a camp when people are telling testimonies and you're about to tell your testimony that is just about you chilling at home and your parents telling you about Jesus and you realizing that you really, really love Jesus, growing up in the church and suddenly you became a good Christian, and then this person comes and they tell you about this testimony where they were literally just going down this road of destruction. They were about to die and this light hit them and suddenly they were saved. And you're like, whoa, I'm not going after that. You see, it does not make them any much of a better Christian than you are. But what it means is that it's their personality to actually give their whole selves into something when they do it. A typical example is the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul, if you want to read this awesome story, starting from Acts chapter 9, the Apostle Paul gives his whole life killing Christians, persecuting Christians, going out and making sure that this whole fallacy about Jesus does not exist anymore. He wants to do away with it. The guy literally goes from city to city trying to persecute Christians. And that's his personality. And then, boom, on Damascus, on his way to go persecute more Christians, when he encounters Jesus, he gives it in. He gives in. And the same energy that he gave towards persecuting Christians is the same energy that he starts giving towards building up the church. So much so that a third quarter of the New Testament was written by him. It's his personality. And so Martha was this kind of person. And so Martha's with Jesus. And as Martha and Mary are about to open up this tomb, Typical Martha. And Martha's such an interesting character. Martha loves order. She loves things to happen in an orderly way. As Jesus is about to open this tomb, because remember, this is 4 days. Lazarus would have been stinking by then. And she's like, wait, God, there's going to be a bad odor that's going to come out of there. That's her personality. It doesn't make her a person of, it doesn't mean that she had lesser faith. She was socialized. That's how she thought. She worried about stuff like that. Wait a second, God, you can't open it. It's going to stink. Nonetheless, Jesus says, open the tomb, and he says, Lazarus, get out. And Lazarus comes out. Lazarus, Christ's best friend, he obviously had a very good relationship with God. And when he encounters Jesus in this sense, this would have been deep and meaningful. Knowing that you were dead, and by the sound of a voice, you came to life again. And so Lazarus comes out, and this is a bit problematic because according to Jewish tradition, they believed that for 3 days after someone has died, there was a slight chance that they could come back to life again. Their belief was that their spirits still hovered over their bodies, and there was a possibility that they could come back to life again. And perhaps this is the reason Jesus delayed and did not respond immediately when they told him that his friend was dying. Perhaps this is why John is intentional in mentioning in John chapter 11 that Jesus stayed 2 more days and did not come. And this was so that, remember, it was a day's journey from where Jesus was to Bethany. And this was so that by the time Jesus arrived, it would have been the 4th day. Had he resurrected Lazarus on the 3rd day, they would have said, we've seen that before, try something new. But the fact that he resurrects him on the 4th day went and spread throughout all Judea. They had never seen anything like this before. This was new. This had never, ever happened before. You see, there are situations where often we think it's normal for someone to get healed after they've been sick for such a time. But there are periods where we start writing off people and we think to ourselves, nothing's going to happen from here. Boy, oh boy, is God about to surprise us. At times it's even with people who have been going down a path of destruction, and we think to ourselves, they've been down that path for way too long. There is just no way they can be saved. Don't you dare try to approach them. Don't you dare try to invite them into your space. Boy, oh boy, we've got something else coming our way. Anyways, in conclusion, and so in John chapter 12, we then read about a meal, a banquet that is hosted in honor of Jesus. We're not told who's at this banquet, but one thing we do know, it is hosted also at Lazarus' place. And as he's hosting Jesus, firstly, it then begins to expose how they all encountered Jesus. Here's something that's really great that I'd love you to hold on to if you missed everything I said today. Our encounter with Jesus informs our experience with Jesus. You see, Martha has encountered Jesus as this guest that often comes into their household, as this guy she's always looking after. And so at the last banquet in John chapter 12, Martha actually is seen there, busy fixing up the kitchen and making sure that everyone is taken care of. It is very easy to write of Martha and say she doesn't matter in this narrative. For all we care, all she was doing was hosting. But without the host, that banquet would have not happened. without those who are here at church every morning, making sure that things are looked after, making sure that all these chairs are neat and they are in proper rows, making sure that the tea is ready, making sure that the pizza's ready after the service. Without them, the banquet would have not happened. Some of the greatest conversations I've had at church are with people after church services while we're just sitting over pizza and we really just enjoying one another's fellowship. Without her, the banquet would have not happened. Secondly, Lazarus is this guy who's encountered Jesus, and if anyone knows that Jesus is truly the Messiah, it has to be Lazarus. And mind you, the day he hosted Jesus, it was 6 days before the Passover, a time that Jews would set apart to fix themselves, to get ready for the Passover. And guess what? Lazarus focuses on Jesus. People are coming from different cities into Jerusalem so that they can get ready for the Passover. And guess what? Lazarus focuses on Jesus. His experience with Jesus informs his relationship with Jesus, because he knew that if there was a Passover, it definitely had something to do with this guy. Now, to even add this more, in those days when you hosted a banquet, what would happen is there would be onlookers who were watching this banquet, who were wanting to see what this prominent person who had been invited would be saying at the banquet, learning stuff from them. And Lazarus hosted a banquet at a time when there would have been a lot of people in Jerusalem, in Judea, in Bethany. And he hosts this banquet. And all these onlookers would have been listening. If Lazarus had to be anything in this narrative, he definitely was the evidence that Christ is Lord. And as the evidence, he uses this to spread the message. So much so that the guys at the Sanhedrin, that's the chief priests and the chief priest and the Sadducees and the Pharisees got together and they said, look, we need to get rid of this guy. We need to kill Lazarus. Because of him, a lot of people are coming to the faith. There are those of you, wherever you go, because of who you used to be and who you've become, people look at you and they're like, sure, God does indeed work. Do not be apologetic about that. You've got to be proud of that. If anything, host a dinner and make sure that there are onlookers. There are people who are watching. There are people who are listening. There are people who are witnessing what Jesus has to say into your life. I don't know about you, but there are times when I'm even skeptical of telling people that I am a Christian or I'm a pastor because I know it's going to be a conversation stopper. Suddenly, conversations are going to stop and they're going to change. I remember this one friend of mine I met when I got to Centurion, and we started talking. Everything was good up until I told her that I'm a youth pastor, and she started telling me about how she hasn't read a Bible in a while. And I was like, oh man, this is the exact reason I never tell people. But I want to encourage you today that you might be a Lazarus. And when people hear that you're a Christian, they want to hear more. They want to ask you shady questions. But behind those shady questions is a deep desire to encounter Jesus. People only ask what they care about. When people start saying, what does your church say about homosexuality? Use that as an opportunity to host a banquet with onlookers watching. And lastly, one of my favorite characters, Mary. And so, as the dinner continues, Mary takes her jar of alabaster oil, perfume that was very expensive. And instead of this perfume, it was taken from India, and people would have to travel for a whole year in order to deliver it to Israel. And so, because it took a whole year, a bottle would cost a whole year's wage. 350 denarii. And she breaks it. And she anoints Jesus with this. You see, no one can understand this. Man, Mary knew what Jesus had done for her. No one else could identify with the feeling that Mary, the feeling of gratitude that Mary had within her. She knew what God did for her. You know, when you start going to church like you're a freak? I remember when I started going to church like crazy, my dad was like, dude, what's happening with you? There's other stuff you should be doing. I'm not going to judge my dad. He did not understand what had just happened in my heart. You know, when you start dedicating your efforts, your talents, your money, everything, and people are like, what are you doing? Stop, stop, stop. This is just not normal. People cannot understand because they cannot identify with the amount of gratitude that you have, because you know what God has done for you. You know what Jesus has done for you. And so extravagant Mary goes on and anoints Jesus' feet. And Judas complains and it says this could have been used for something better. Meanwhile, he didn't realize that these three friends have been led into a secret. And the secret was, Jesus is not about to die forever. He will live on forever. You see, at times, the things you know about God may not make sense to other people. And because of that, they will not understand the things you do. At times, your relationship with God does not make sense to other people. And because of that, they do not understand why you decide to make the decisions you make at work. At times, people do not understand the place from which you are acting. It's okay. Host a banquet. Make sure that the hall is set up and ready for everyone to encounter Jesus. And even more, break that alabaster jar. Anoint a body that will be crucified but will not die forever. May God bless you. May God strengthen you on your journey. May God continue to shine his face upon you. Amen.